Good afternoon, Dave Ripplinger, Bioenergy, Bioproducts Economic Specialist with NDSU Extension. I'm going to talk about carbon credits and somewhat how they relate to cover crop implementation here in North Dakota. Just a little bit of background on the original motivation for this. So for the most part, until recently, when most people hear the word carbon contracts, what we've been talking about are carbon offset contracts. And again, what's been presented to the farmer doesn't necessarily give this overall picture of what's going on and why. And that can be important when deciding to engage in a relationship with someone, in sense, doing your due diligence. So just talking about carbon offsets generally, there's a number of corporations, less so now than a few months ago, who are engaged in looking at ways to reduce their greenhouse emissions or otherwise address their emissions as a business. There's a name of a few of the bigger players in this space, or the logos for a few of the bigger places in this space over on the right. And what's important in this, and what a lot of these folks are looking at, is they've looked at their own business and they found that there aren't easy ways to decarbonize. But within the broader economy, there may be those opportunities. So what they're looking to do is to purchase a credit which would offset their ongoing emissions. And so that's really where we sit. And of course, they've come to agriculture pretty aggressively in the last 5 years or so for a variety of reasons. One, because we interact more with the environment than any other industry. We can do it at scale. We can do it for a lower cost. We can do it in a way that can be easily measured, verified, and it's, at least to some extent, permanent. Next slide I'm going to show just generally, there's been a lot of work done in terms of developing an accounting system for greenhouse gas emissions, and there's many different dimensions to that. On the corporate accounting side, they put things into buckets, which are different scopes. And again, a company like Disney might look at their emissions and say, well, there's really not an easy way for us to decarbonize. But maybe there's someone who can go do that. And really what they're looking for is not necessarily a particular practice, but rather just a carbon credit in and of itself. Of course, coming to agriculture, there's been a lot of interaction over the last few years, certainly in the press. Some number of North Dakota farmers have participated in these programs, continue to participate in these programs, but for the most part, adoption has been relatively light. As I mentioned, really what folks are looking at is these multinational corporations looking to offset their own emissions. That's where the carbon offset term comes from. One of the challenges in this, if you've been a long time practitioner of something like no-till, is they're really only interested in new or recent adopters. So if you've been using cover crops on the same field for, in this case, we'd be looking at more than a decade, you're probably not even eligible, would not be a desired person to provide these offsets. Same thing if your operation's been no-till for 30 years. And the reason this makes sense, Disney wants to offset their emissions. Well, if nothing's changing in the broader system, what would they be paying for? And this has been kind of a point of contention, here in North Dakota, especially on the tillage side, because we have reduced the no-till across much of the state. But there's some other news as I'll get through my talk to address that. Again, looking at what a corporation is looking at buying, they really don't necessarily care about, know about, understand production agriculture, really have any understanding of what cover crops are or tillage or alternative nutrient management are. But what they're, again, really looking at is where can they go and find a credible credit that says that someone has made a change that resulted in either a reduction of emissions, avoided emissions, or that carbon dioxide is captured and stored in the soil. And so that's really what they're looking for. And again, these credits are in metric tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. And this is what they're looking for. And cover crops work well in this system because, of course, all of these other benefits that we talk about all day, environmental benefits to the soil and such, benefits in livestock, crop management. And of course, here we're in much of it from the greenhouse gas side of things. We're really talking about the ability to produce more biological material and then store it to some degree in the soil. And so that's why something like cover crops is of interest, similar to that with changes in tillage. Why are corporations doing this? And so a lot of misunderstanding. There are real reasons why a business might be interested in and be actively in this space. One is current or expected regulatory requirements. There are rules in the European Union. Many of these corporations do significant business in Europe, so they already have regulations in place and regulations that are growing over time. For some, it's been about attracting financing. If we go back 4 years ago, it was difficult for many corporations, particularly those that had a story that wasn't appealing in some ways to certain financiers. And so it was difficult for certain groups. And, being in North Dakota, the best example of that was oil and gas development. If they went to Wall Street, they had a really tough time getting financing for the last few years. That's changing or declining in some respect. It's about risk management, concerns about what regulatory risk they might have, what risk they might have in terms of market share and all these different pieces. The next piece is marketing. Many businesses have a brand. They want their brand to look good. They also might have specific products that might leverage a story that would benefit from having, a product having a smaller carbon footprint. The brand broadly is obviously very, very valuable. For a particular product, in general, it's only a small number of consumers who will pay more for a product that has certain environmental attributes. But in general, if everything else being equal, if there's two products and one has that better story, consumers will typically buy that product with that better story. And to some extent, there's been shareholder and outside pressure, again, to get corporations to do this. Again, the motivation behind this is understand that these are real buyers. There's a real motivation for them doing this. Also important because we seem to be in a period of less interest in carbon offsets, to let you know that some of these motivations are going to remain. There might be less activity for the next 5 or 10 years in carbon offsets, but these general motivations for this large group, relatively powerful, well-funded group, is going to remain. And so there may be less activity for carbon offsets from agriculture in the next few years, but these corporations are going to continue looking for a solution. Talking about how farmers are paid, again, there's been a variety of contracts available. Those contracts have varied from contract to contract, from business to business that was offering them. They've also varied over time, looking for kind of that sweet spot to get folks interested in to engage in these contracts so that these carbon credits can be produced. Practices typically by the acre, tillage and cover crops are very much at the top of the list. Nutrient management to some extent is also in that space. What is done as part of establishing a protocol for carbon credits is a business would have a group of scientists who would essentially estimate what greenhouse gas reductions we might expect from adopting these practices. And again, this can have varying degrees of accuracy and precision, but that ends up being part of the protocol that would be approved by a registry. And once that protocol and process is approved, then once that business gets farmers to sign up, they can essentially produce these credits that have some degree of credibility behind them because all of this work has been reviewed. It's an interesting process. It's an interesting space, but one that's becoming ever more present both in this specific situation and other parts of both government regulation and voluntary markets. Just a little bit of background. This is the most recent data that I can get. Purdue University does a monthly survey of farmers across the Midwest, and so leaning more on corn and soybean farmers. than what we might see across the state of North Dakota. Their most recent survey where they've asked this specific question regarding carbon offsets is now already just a bit over a year ago, and I'd say probably not much has changed. Their big findings: about 8% of corn and soybean farmers had discussions. So this would be visiting with a rep from one of these carbon offset companies, a carbon credit company. Of those, only 2% have reported entering into agreements, and they've been paid representatively somewhere between about $10 and $30 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. Again, remember, that's what a Disney would want to buy. And then when we translate this to a per acre basis, this could be somewhere between $3, maybe $10 or $15, depending on the practice or combinations of practices. So $3, especially if it's a practice you're already considering doing, absolutely, but not a tremendous amount of money. Once you hit those larger amounts, it certainly does become appealing that incentive in and of itself might lead farmers to consider or reconsider adopting cover crops, other practices. One of the important things to note, and that can be missed, when carbon offsets have been presented to farmers, what's typically presented to them is a proposition that we'll pay you so much for a practice. And so it might seem logical to say, well, I'm a farmer, cover crops kind of made sense, that $5 puts it over the top, I'm going to do it. That's not the right way to frame it, because you have to think about, again, what's actually being purchased. Again, Disney doesn't really care about cover cropping. They care about the carbon. And so if you have that basic framework where I'm a farmer, I'm going to implement cover crops because with all of these other benefits and this next $5, it's going to make sense. That's great. You're missing the value of the carbon. That's what Disney wants. That's what these multinational corporations want. And in many cases, you can't sell that carbon twice. So if you do participate in a carbon offset contract, you may be limited then in marketing the crops grown in that field in that year or in subsequent years from capturing other value that might be available because you've already sold this offset. A little bit of an update in terms of what's been going on in the last year or so, especially. There's been a lot less interest in carbon offsets. One of the bigger players, when it was fully active, we had about 10 or 12 different companies in this space. One of them has shut down. Another, Ecosystem Market Services Consortium, is still in the carbon space, but they're not doing carbon offsets. And then two of the bigger players, Truterra and Indigo Ag, have decided to collaborate with one another. They both had some pretty sizable investments, a lot of activity in the space, really, two of the bigger players, and they're going to continue on, looking to maintain and develop this market. Moving to a related issue, and this isn't necessarily a carbon credit topic, but it's really right next door to it, and that's the opportunity with carbon insets. In this case, we're looking at a business's own supply chain and the emissions within it. And so if we think about a farmer, you're in many different supply chains. If you're growing wheat, you are in a mill's supply chain. You are in a baker's supply chain, in a consumer product facing space supply chain. You also have all of your inputs and the like. And so many of these corporations that you do business with, or that someone that you do business with does business with, they're also interested in these emissions. And so they're looking at, what can they do to quantify emissions as they exist, or find lower carbon crops or products in that supply chain. And this is what we call scope 3. So this, for going back to those greenhouse gas accounting principles, there's 3 different buckets. The third bucket is a business's supply chain. So they are, when they do their accounting, they need to have an understanding of that, the emissions associated with that entire supply chain, which can be really quite broad in food and agriculture. One of the benefits about this is you don't have to change anything. So there's no additionality requirement. So for example, if I was growing spring wheat in Western North Dakota, the carbon footprint of my wheat is substantially lower than that grown with conventional tillage. That's generally recognized, and we're starting to see opportunities for incentives to be provided to those farmers so that that value can be captured and then shared along that supply chain. Again, a few different ways to do this. At the top of the list are still cover crops, tillage, and nutrient management. An example program that's been available recently from ADM, obviously a large marketer of grain, processor of grain and oil seeds, in the region and internationally. They have a demonstration, a pilot program funded in part by a USDA Climate Smart Ag public-private partnership program, which is still, to my knowledge, frozen with the new administration. But it's a good way to kind of see what insets currently look like and will likely look like in the future. And here it's a relatively simple framework. Do you grow one of a certain number of crops? And here we can look at North Dakota and say corn, soybeans, wheat, canola, yes, yes, yes. Farming practices, cover crops, tillage, nutrient management, possibly. And then they have the math behind the scenes. A farmer doesn't need to see that. But what the farmer would see is that they could get an extra 2 to 4 cents for corn, 5 to 7 cents per bushel of soybeans delivered. Again, a slight premium for those practices. And in essence, what a farmer would do is they would sign an attestation saying, okay, this is how I grew it. And, ADM would, or another business would reserve the right to go and verify to some extent. And we'll see some of those things built out in the coming years. But that's just kind of this general framework that we're going to see. And it could be, it'll be years before this is the general framework. But certainly that it's rather likely that we'll have this space in the next 10, 20 years for sure, where farmers will be able to go and say, yeah, this is a crop. Cover crops are in the rotation, they're part of the system, and then receive some premium for that. Just an example too, it's important to note this isn't just related to the crop side, it's also related to the livestock side. Tyson is obviously a large business in the meat space. They have stated goals, they have their motivations, access to capital, which has been true, customer demand somewhat weakly, and they've been looking at a few specific things, not necessarily cover crop specific, but again, in this space, and especially as you go on and look forward across the years, the benefits of having managed grazing or incorporating cover crops into that integrated livestock crop system, that's the exact type of activity that would produce a carbon inset, something that would be of interest to someone in that space. At the same time, too, Tyson has been sued because they weren't actually following up with some of their claims that they were making. They had set these goals and didn't have anything to point to in terms of true activities. Over time, we're going to get to the point where there will be an increasing amount of activity, and eventually get to the point where this is just how grain is marketed. How farmers would actually capture some value by how they grow their crop. Currently, the better and best way to actually capture value, create value for a farmer is by growing a low carbon crop that's used in the biofuel industry. California has a low carbon fuel standard that's supported the development of renewable diesel, as well as crush plants in the state, further supporting soybeans in the state, also supporting the economics of ethanol and corn. Canada has a similar rule, and we also have a tax credit in the United States called 45Z, which also incentivizes the production of low carbon fuels, and that does push back into what happens on the farm. And so all three of those are policy related, and so there's a little bit of policy risk. At the same time, they each are concerned with, well, what's the actual carbon footprint of a given fuel? Can it be made smaller? And then, how might this relate to a farmer? For both Canada's clean fuel standard and for 45Z, which is the US uh, tax credit, both of those do go back to the farm, to farm specific, field specific type measures. 45Z, we don't actually have a final rule on. So we can't say too much of exactly how that's going to look, but that was the intent of part of that program. Again, to incentivize change at the farm level. Reducing the carbon footprint would result in a larger tax credit, and the expectation that farmers would be able to capture some of that themselves. Already talked about additionality with offsets and insets. The other big issue is stacking. And stacking is the idea that I might be able to access a variety of incentives. So these could be higher price at the elevator with an inset type thing, making a change, selling an offset. In general, especially with cover crops, and one of the things that first comes to mind is, there's federal programs, NRCS, that will help you begin and continue your activity in this space. Generally, you can receive those funds as well as sell carbon offsets or receive carbon insets. That is seen as just getting people to the finish line, getting them above the threshold so they can actually adopt these practices, use these practices. The bigger issue where stacking is oftentimes not allowed is if I would sell an offset and still want to count that for my inset. So for example, if I sold an offset and then I went to my ADM elevator and said, oh, I'd also like this 4 cents. Well, the fine print's going to say, have you received an offset for these practices? And you wouldn't be eligible. Kind of summarizing what I presented. I'll see if we'll have time for some questions. It's really important to note, and I think that there's people on who've been involved in this for quite some time as well. This carbon thing is very real. It's matured rather quickly, and actually we're kind of into this next stage where insets are more important, or likely more important for most farmers than offsets. Exactly what this means to an individual farmer can be a bit of a challenge, and I wish that I could provide better guidance. But without some further development in the market, it's difficult to prescribe what approach might work best. For farmers, one of the things I definitely recommend is to find a trusted advisor who has some degree of expertise in this space. So about a month and a half ago, I gave a similar talk to certified crop advisors. Extension to some extent can play a role in this, but a farmer should decide exactly how much how much expertise they want to have and develop, and how much they want to be able to partner with. And again, many of these opportunities, and especially with 45Z, that would come rather quickly. But again, I don't expect farmers to become extremely well versed on this, because this becomes just another thing that they might know. Again, from my perspective, it's to understand the broader benefits, the economics, the impacts on the cropping system with something like cover crops, as opposed to the details about how, why the market might work a certain way, because in many respects that will come to them. It is important to stay up to date. We'll see how quickly new rules are promulgated. If 45Z rules come out, that will have a significant impact, again, because that would incentivize farm level practices. And again, giving draft language, we would expect that would include cover crops. Also, and I have it in a bracket again, because offsets have kind of declined in importance. My general advice is to start with the economics of the practice before you think about credits or other policies, right? So then there's all of these dimensions to consider before implementing cover crops, because it is a significant change in one's cropping system. Don't start with I can get $5 an acre if I adopt cover crops. Instead, I would go through the full process and say, wow, this makes sense. Maybe I should have done it earlier, but I'm going to start doing it. Then you can go look for an offset to add to that, or if it's close and someone comes to you and say, hey, we have these offsets available, that would be a better way than just saying, okay, if I can get that $5, that's going to move me so far. Insets are, and especially on the biofuel side, that is the way that we're going to be doing business ever increasingly, and more so than offsets going forward. And one of the last pieces of advice that I have is to start keeping records. And this is a really tough thing to say, because then the question becomes, what records? How do I keep them? Where do I keep them? Who's going to want them and all that? And the truth is, we really don't have that clarification yet. In general, to have an understanding of, if you have or adopting cover crops, keep that same information that you might be sharing or have to share with NRCS. That same type of information will likely be required or may be required for carbon offsets, or, more importantly, or probably a little bit more on the inset side. Those are my prepared remarks. I don't know if we have time for a couple of questions. I do apologize. There's a whole lot to cover within this space, and we're really at this kind of pivot point in terms of moving from a lot of interest in offsets to more interest in insets, and this potential that we're going to have a huge change in production economics if and when 45Z's final rules are released.